Rashomon. Ryunosuke Akutagawa. One evening toward dusk, a servant was waiting for the rain to let up beneath the Rashomon Gate. Beneath the wide gate, there was no one but this man. Only a single cricket clung to one of the great round pillars, its cinnabar lacquer peeling here and there. Since Rashomon stood on Suzaku Avenue, one would think there would be 2 or 3 others, someone with a city woman's hat, or a man in a rumpled eboshi, also waiting out the shower. Yet there was no one besides this man. The reason was this. For the past 2 or 3 years, Kyoto had been struck by one calamity after another: earthquakes, whirlwind, fires, and famine. The decline of the capital was beyond ordinary telling. Old records say people smashed Buddhas and altar furnishings and piled the wood, stained with cinnabar or flecked with gold or silver leaf, by the roadside to sell as firewood. If that was the plight within the city, there was no one to spare a thought for repairing Rashomon. In the ruins, foxes took up lairs, thieves found shelter, and in the end a custom arose of bringing the unclaimed dead to this gate and dumping them. When daylight failed, everyone shunned the place, shrinking from the eeriness and keeping their feet away. Instead, crows gathered here from who knows where. By day you could see any number of them circling in rings around the high Shibi ridge ornaments, cawing as they wheeled. Most clearly of all, when the sky above the gate went red with sunset, they stood out like scattered sesame. Of course they came to peck at the flesh of the corpses laid above. Today, perhaps because the hour was late, not a single crow was in sight. Only on the worn, partially collapsed stone steps, grass growing from the cracks here and there, white crow droppings clung in specks. The servant sat on the topmost of the 7 steps, setting the seat of his washed-out blue robe down and, worrying at a large pimple on his right cheek, gazed absent-mindedly at the falling rain. A moment ago, the author wrote, "The servant was waiting for the rain to stop." But even if the rain did stop, the servant had no particular place to go. Ordinarily, of course, he should have returned to his master's house, but the master had dismissed him 4 or 5 days earlier. As already said, Kyoto was in unusual decline. The servant's discharge after years of service was merely one small ripple of that decline. So more fitting than waiting for the rain to stop would be, caught in the rain, with nowhere to go, the servant was at a loss what to do. On top of that, today's weather weighed a bit on this Heian-era servant's sentimentalism. The rain that began in the late hour of the monkey still showed no sign of lifting. So trying somehow to arrange for tomorrow's living, in other words, trying to do something about what could not be done, he let his thoughts wander, listening without listening to the sound of the rain falling on Suzaku Avenue. The rain wrapped the gate and gathered sounds from far off into one long hiss. The dusk drew the sky lower and lower, and when he looked up, the roof of the gate seemed to prop a heavy, dim cloud on the tips of its jutting eaves. If one is to do something about what cannot be done, there is no leisure to choose among means. If he chose, he would do no more than starve to death under a mud wall or on bare earth by the roadside, and be brought to this gate and thrown away like a dog. If he did not choose, after pacing the same track many times, the servant's thoughts at last reached this point. But this if would not, in the end, become anything more than if. Even while affirming that he could not afford to be choosy, he still lacked the courage to affirm, as he must, the conclusion that would naturally follow. There is nothing for it but to become a thief. The servant gave a great sneeze and then, with a weary air, stood up. Kyoto in the evening chill was cold enough to make one long for a brazier. The wind blew without ceremony between the pillars of the gate, hand in hand with the growing dark. The cricket that had perched on the vermilion pillar was gone, drawing in his neck against the cold, hunching the shoulders of the blue robe over his yellow undergarment. He looked around the gate. If he could find a place safe from wind and rain and from people's eyes, he meant to pass the night there somehow. Happily, his eye fell on a broad ladder, lacquered cinnabar, leading up to the tower above the gate. If anyone was up there, they would be dead bodies anyway. Taking care that the hilt of the sacred-handled sword at his waist would not catch in the scabbard, he set his straw-sandaled foot on the lowest rung. Some minutes later a man, crouched like a cat on the middle landings of the wide ladder up to the tower, held his breath and peered at what was going on above. A light from the upper floor faintly wetted his right cheek, the cheek with a short stubble and a pimple reddened with pus. From the outset, he had assumed that whoever was above would be only corpses. But after he climbed 2 or 3 steps, he realized someone up there had lit a flame and was moving it about. He knew at once from the way that turbid yellow light swayed and threw itself up onto the webbed rafters in the shadowy ceiling. On a rainy night, anyone making a light in Rashomon would hardly be an ordinary person. Stealing his steps like a gecko, he at last crawled up to the top rung of the steep ladder. Flattening his body as much as possible and thrusting his neck forward as far as he could, he cautiously looked into the tower. Inside, just as rumor had it, several corpses had been tossed down any which way. But because the reach of the light was narrower than he expected, he could not tell how many. He could only make out dimly that some bodies were naked and some clothed, and that both women and men seemed to be among them. The corpses lay sprawled across the floor like clay dolls, mouths gaping, arms flung out, to the point where it was hard even to believe they had ever been living people. On shoulders and chests, where the bodies rose, the faint light fell and made the hollows darker still, while they remained forever silent as mutes. The servant, overcome by the stench of decay, instinctively covered his nose. But in the next instant he forgot to cover it. A powerful emotion had all but stolen his sense of smell away. The servant's eyes, for the first time, made out a living person crouching among the corpses. An old woman, short and gaunt, with white hair, dressed in a robe the color of cypress bark, monkey-like in aspect. In her right hand she held a lighted splinter of pine and was peering into the face of one of the bodies. Judging from the long hair, likely the corpse of a woman. Driven by 6 parts fear and 4 parts curiosity, the servant even forgot to breathe for a while. To borrow the phrasing of old chronicles, the hair of his head and body bristled. Then the crone stuck the pine splinter between the floorboards, and putting both hands to the corpse's neck she had been studying, began to pluck out the long hairs one by one, like a mother monkey picking lice from her young. The hair seemed to come out readily in her hands. As each single hair came free, the servant's fear ebbed a little, and in its place there rose a fierce hatred toward this old woman, or, more precisely, a mounting aversion to evil of any kind. If, at that moment, someone had raised again the question that had occupied him beneath the gate, starve to death or become a thief, he would likely have chosen starvation without the slightest regret. So hotly did his hatred of evil flare up now, like the flame of the pine splinter the crone had thrust into the floor. Of course, he had no idea why she was plucking hair from the dead. He could not, on any reasonable grounds, decide whether it was good or evil. Yet to him, on this rainy night, here above the Rashomon, the very act of pulling hair from a corpse was in itself an unpardonable evil. Needless to say, he had long since forgotten that moments earlier he had been ready to become a thief. He braced both feet and in a bound sprang up from the ladder. With his hand to the hilt of his sacred-handled sword, he strode in great steps before the old woman. Her shock, needless to say, was extreme. At a glance at the servant, she sprang up, as if loosed from a crossbow. "Where do you think you're going?" Blocking her path as she stumbled over a corpse and tried in panic to flee, he shouted this abuse. She still tried to shove past him. He shoved her back. For a time the two grappled in silence among the bodies. But the outcome was never in doubt. The servant at last seized her arm, and, by force, wrenched her down to the floor. An arm all bone and skin, like a chicken's leg. "What were you doing? Speak! If you won't, then this." He flung her off, and in a flash, swept the sheath from his sword and thrust the white steel before her eyes. But the old woman said nothing. Her hands trembled, her shoulders heaved for breath, and her eyes, bulging as if to pop from their lids, stared wide, mute and stubborn as a dumb beast. Seeing this, the servant for the first time became clearly aware that the woman's life or death lay wholly in his will, and that awareness cooled the hatred that had burned so sharply a moment before. What remained was only the quiet self-satisfaction and contentment that attend a task neatly done. Looking down at her, he softened his voice a little and said, "I'm no officer from the Bureau of Police. I'm a traveller who happened to pass beneath this gate just now. I've no intent to bind you or anything of the sort. Only tell me what you were doing up here at this hour. That is all I ask." At this, the old woman opened her eyes even wider and fixed them on his face, sharp as a bird of prey. The rims of her lids reddened. Her wrinkled lips, almost one with her nose, worked as if chewing something. In her thin throat, the pointed Adam's apple could be seen moving. Then, from that throat, a crow-like voice, rasping and gasping, reached the servant's ears. "I'm pulling this hair to make a wig." The servant was disappointed at so commonplace an answer, and with the disappointment his former hatred returned, now mingled with a cold contempt. Sensing his change of temper, the old woman, still clutching in one hand the long strand she had torn from the dead woman's head, began to mutter in a toad-like croak. "True enough. To pluck hair from the dead may be a wicked thing. But all the dead lying here are the sort who deserve at least this much. Why, the woman whose hair I just pulled, she used to cut snakes into pieces 4 sun long, dry them, and sell them as dried fish to the men at the guard post. Had she not died of the pest, she'd be selling them still. And mind you, those men said the dried fish she sold were tasty, and never failed to buy them for their fare. I don't think what she did was evil, else she would have starved. She did it because she had to. So then, what I'm doing now is no evil either. I too would starve if I didn't. I'm doing this because I have no choice. And knowing that compulsion so well herself, this woman, I reckon, would look kindly on what I do." Such, in substance, was what the old woman said. Sliding his sword back into its sheath, the servant held the hilt with his left hand and listened coolly, while his right kept worrying the large pimple on his cheek, red and full of pus. As he listened, a certain courage began to form in his heart, a courage he had lacked a short while earlier beneath the gate, and one that now moved him in the very opposite direction from the boldness that had carried him up here to seize the old woman. He no longer wavered between starving and turning thief. In his present state, the very idea of starving had been thrust so far outside his consciousness that he could scarcely think of it.
Indeed. So that's how it is.
When the crone had finished, he pressed her with a mocking voice. Then, taking a step forward, he suddenly lifted his right hand from the pimple, seized her by the hair at the nape, and snacked at her as if biting.
Then you won't begrudge me if I strip you. If I don't do the same, I'll starve.
He swiftly tore the robe from the old woman, and as she clutched at his legs, kicked her roughly down onto the heap of corpses. It was only 5 paces to the ladder's mouth. Tucking the cypress bark-colored robe under his arm, he darted to the opening and clattered down the steep rungs into the depths of the night. After lying as if dead for a while, the crone soon raised her naked body from among the corpses. Muttering and moaning, and guided by the glow of the still-burning splinter, she crawled to the head of the ladder. Hanging her short white hair downward, she peered beneath the gate. Outside there was only night, black and bottomless. No one knows where the servant went. Thank you for listening until the end. For anyone who loves Japanese literature, or just wants calm readings to help with focus, relaxation, or sleep, this channel is for you. Please like the video and subscribe.